although I did try it on this original gadget and it was okay. Yeah, so I'll try and keep an eye on the chat just in case something comes up. Okay. Good evening. I trust you've had a fruitful day. I don't say happy, although I hope it's been happy. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage to the Buddha, the blessed, noble, and fully self-awakened one. So I've moved on to a different discourse now, and I won't tell you the name because it's part of the discourse. But it all begins with this fellow called Dandapani. Where is he? Here we are, Dandapani. Now he also is a Sakyan, like the Buddha, belongs to the same clan in just below, well, what's present day the border of Nepal and India. And he's walking and wandering for exercise in the great wood. And he sees the Blessed One, exchanges greetings, and then he stood to one side, leaning on his stick. He asked the Blessed One, what does the recluse assert? What does he proclaim? So there's no gentility about this. Normally it's the Blessed One or the recluse Gautama. He just comes out, as it were, quite direct. And the Buddha answers, I assert and proclaim such a teaching that one does not quarrel with anyone in the world, with its gods, its maras, its brahmas, in this generation, with its recluses and brahmins, its princes and its people, such that perceptions no more underlie that Brahmin who abides detached from sensual pleasures, without perplexity, shorn of worry, free from craving of any kind of becoming. Okay, so Dandapani shook his head, wagged his tongue, and raised his eyebrows until his forehead was puckered in 3 lines. Then he departed, leaning on his stick. Dandapani is a nickname. It means stick in hand. Now, the commentaries say that he supported Devadatta, who was the renegade monk who tried to kill the Buddha and set up his own order, and eventually set up his own order. I'm sure you all know that story. Yeah? So now, when it was evening, the Blessed One rose from meditation and went to Nigroda's park, where he sat down on a seat made ready for him, and there were some bhikkhus there. And they asked him, what is it? Because they must have heard this answer. Venerable Sir, what is the teaching that the Blessed One asserts, whereby one does not quarrel with anyone in the world, with its princes and its people, etc.? How is it that perceptions no more underlie that Brahmin who abides detached from sensual pleasures, without perplexity, shorn of worry, free from craving for any kind of being or becoming? So here we have, just remember that phrase there, that perceptions no more underlie the Brahmin. So here the Brahmin means somebody who's liberated, who abides detached from sensual pleasures, etc. And the Buddha answers, as to the source through which perceptions and notions, tinged by mental proliferation, beset a man, if nothing is found there to delight in, welcome, and hold on to, this is the end of the underlying tendency to lust, of the underlying tendency to aversion, of the underlying tendency to views, to doubt, to conceit, to desire for becoming, to ignorance. This is the end of resorting to rods and weapons, of quarrels, brawls, disputes, recrimination, malice, and false speech. Here these evil, unwholesome states cease without remainder. Now that is what the Blessed One said. And having said that, the Sublime One rose from his seat and went into his dwelling. And soon after that, these monks said to themselves, the Blessed One has gone to his dwelling after giving a summary and brief without expounding the detailed meaning. Now, who will expound it for us? And then they think of Mahakachana. And Mahakachana was also fully liberated, and he was nominated by the Buddha, or given the title by the Buddha, of foremost in expounding the subtleties of the Dharma. So they go to see Mahakachana and exchange greetings, the usual pleasantries. And Mahakachana replies, "Friends, it is as though a man needing heartwood, seeking heartwood, wandering in search of heartwood, thought that heartwood should be sought for among the branches and leaves of a great tree, standing possessed of heartwood, after he had passed over the root and trunks. So it is with you, Venerable Sir, that you think that I should be asked about the meaning of this after you passed the Blessed One by, when you were face to face with the teacher. For knowing, the Blessed One knows. Seeing, he sees. He is vision, he is knowledge, he is the Dharma. He is the Holy One. He is the sayer, the proclaimer, the elucidator of meaning, the giver of the deathless, the Lord of the Dhamma, Tathagata, the transcendent one. That was the time when you should have asked the Blessed One the meaning. As I told you, and as he told you, you should have remembered it." So they say, well, of course, this is true. There was that time, and we would have remembered it. But Mahakachana is praised by the teacher and esteemed by his wise companions in the holy life. Let the Venerable Mahakachana expound it without finding it troublesome. Okay, listen, friends, says Mahakachana. Friends, when the Blessed One rose from his seat and went to his dwelling after giving this summary, so if you remember the statement, I'll just read it again because it's core to the discourse. As to the source through which perceptions and notions, tinged by mental proliferation, beset a man, if nothing is found there to delight in, welcome, hold on to, this is the underlying tendency of all unwholesome states. So now Mahakachana explains this. So some of it, hopefully you will grasp, because we did do it in earlier discourses. Dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. When one feels, that one perceives. What one perceives, that one thinks about. What one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. With what one has mentally proliferated as the source, perceptions and notions tinged by mental proliferation beset a man with respect to the past, the future, and present forms cognizable through the eye. So there's your process, and I'm sure you'll recognize it very well. Having seen something, there comes a feeling whereby you say to yourself, this is pleasant or unpleasant. But there also is a perception. That perception will be an apperception, which means that it will fit into your past notions about what you're looking at. Then we think about it, and before we know it, we're off, we're proliferating. So just take a simple example. If you see somebody whom you've had some problems with, because that's always an easy one, and you see them, then there is, of course, not a very good feeling, and your perception of them is added to your past perceptions of them. So that the concept of them is growing. That process is called, by the way, apperception, technically. And then, of course, once you're into it, off the mind goes, thinking its angry thoughts or its anxious thoughts, worry thoughts, etc. 1 second. So now, of course, he goes through all the senses and, of course, through memories. That's the past. And, of course, thinking about the future. So the mind constantly proliferates on a simple input from one of the 6 senses, something you've seen, heard, touched, etc., and something you remember, or something that comes up into your mind. And then, of course, that's really sort of pointed out that with eye consciousness, it is possible to point out the manifestation of contact. So all of these are connected. So you've got contact, from contact feeling, from feeling perception. So in Buddhist psychology, whenever there's a feeling, a perception is concurrent. They both arise together. Okay, perception with a feeling, and a feeling with a perception, an idea, a photocopy, you could say. And with that perception, that becomes points to a manifestation of thinking. Once there's thinking, then of course, beset by these perceptions and notions, there is this mental proliferation, and off we go into fantasies. And then, of course, he says the opposite. If none of that happens, and remember, it's always based on underlying tendencies, unwholesome tendencies. So, for instance, when the Buddha is asked a question, that question will always be just slightly different from all past questions, and it will demand some creative response. But he's not proliferating on unwholesome tendencies that lie underneath his consciousness. He's coming from the heart of wisdom and the heart of compassion, and therefore, even though he's speaking, it wouldn't be called unwholesome. Okay, so we also can do that, but remember that always for us, underlying everything we do is always this sense of self, which mucks everything up. You know? So just to state that again, so as to the source through which perceptions and notions tinged by mental proliferation beset a man, if nothing is found there to delight in, so this is somebody who's liberated, nothing to delight in, to welcome, to hold on to, this is the end of the underlying tendency to lust. Okay, to lust here means all greeds. Aversions, views, conceit, that's a big one. Conceit doesn't go till the very end, the sense of I am, and with it comparison, better than, worse than, and so on. And it's the end of resorting to rods and weapons, quarrels, brawls, disputes, recrimination, malice, and false speech. Here these evil, unwholesome states cease without remainder. And that's why he says, the world argues with me, I do not argue with the world. This is what the Buddha says of himself. Now the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in Venerable Kachana's work, and they rose to their seats and went to the Blessed One. And after they had paid the usual homage, they explained to him what Mahakachana had said. And the Blessed One says, Mahakachana is wise, bhikkhus. Mahakachana has great wisdom. If you had asked me the meaning of this, I would have explained it to you in the same way that Mahakachana has explained it. Such is the meaning of this, and so you should remember it. Okay, so there we have the this process. What the Buddha is pointing out is the process whereby we make things worse for ourselves. So remember, any unwholesome motivation, any unwholesome underlying tendency which rises into consciousness, as soon as it begins to proliferate as a fantasy, or any sort of fantasy, then we are developing it. This is the point, we're developing it. So therefore we have to be straight on the ball as soon as we see we're dreaming, we're fantasizing about something, even if it looks rather good, you know, like saving the world from disaster and all that. You know, just to come off it, let it go, and see if you can catch the underlying feeling. You know, any of these tendencies, to conceit, you know, to being great, to being famous, to being rich, to being powerful, there'll always be some underlying tendency there. And recognizing that, turning our attention towards it, turning our attention towards it and feeling it, allowing it to manifest, right, is the way that that we heal the heart of these corruptions, of these turbulences, right? They've got to come into consciousness some way or other, right? That's the purification process. And that's, of course, what's happening when we practice Vipassana. So now, when this was all said, the Venerable Ananda, who remember is always with the Buddha for the last 20 years, he's his assistant. Venerable Sir, just as a man exhausted by hunger and weakness came upon a honey ball, in the course of eating it, he would find a sweet, delectable flavor. So too, Venerable Sir, any able-minded bhikkhu or meditator, in the course of scrutinizing with wisdom the meaning of this discourse on the Dhamma, would find satisfaction and confidence of mind. Venerable Sir, what is the name of this discourse of the Dhamma? And the Buddha replies, as to that, Ananda, you may remember this discourse on the Dhamma as the Honeyball Discourse. That is what the Blessed One said, and the Venerable Ananda was satisfied and delighted in the Buddha's words. Now, a honey ball, if I can find out, here we are, just a minute. These are the ingredients of a honey ball. Something like flour, ghee, molasses, honey, sugar, and so on. So it's definitely a honey ball. So that's the teaching of this rather lovely little discourse, the Honeyball Discourse. Don't let the mind proliferate. And as soon as you do see it proliferating, come off it. It's a drug. And try to feel the underlying tendency. Allowing it to rise and pass away is the way to purify the heart. I can only hope this rather lovely little discourse has inspired you, and that by your continuing practice, you will be liberated from all suffering sooner rather than